The scream tore through the peaceful afternoon at Oak Ridge Nature Preserve, slicing the air like a knife. 6-year-old Olivia Thompson lay sprawled on the forest floor, her small body pinned beneath 90 pounds of muscled German Shepherd. Blood trickled from her wrist as the dog's jaws clamped down. 20 feet away, Mason Hayes froze mid-stride, horror etching across his weathered face. "Get that beast off her!" Frank Miller's voice boomed through the trees as he rushed forward, walking stick raised high. The child's piercing wails echoed as 3 hikers converged, yanking the snarling dog backward. Olivia's tear-streaked face contorted in terror, her bloody hand clutched to her chest. Amanda Thompson burst through the underbrush toward her daughter, falling to her knees on the soft earth. "What has that monster done?" she screamed, gathering her trembling child. Behind them, partially hidden by summer foliage, a weathered sign hung askew, warning toxic plants present. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Oak Ridge, Oregon sat nestled between the dense forests and rolling hills of the Cascade foothills, a town of just under 5,000 souls, where gossip traveled faster than the logging trucks that still occasionally rumbled through Main Street. Once thriving on timber and the old paper mill that now stood abandoned at the edge of town, Oak Ridge found itself divided between those embracing its new identity as an outdoor recreation hub and those yearning for the industrial prosperity of bygone days. Mason Hayes had chosen this place precisely because it promised anonymity. At 35, the former Army Ranger carried more than just physical scars from 3 tours in Afghanistan. He'd purchased a small cabin on 2 acres at the outskirts of town 3 months ago, seeking solitude for himself and his constant companion, Ranger. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had served alongside Mason, detecting explosives and saving countless lives before a Taliban ambush left both of them wounded and sent home for good. Ranger wasn't just a pet. He was Mason's lifeline. The dog's steady presence kept the nightmares at bay and pulled Mason back whenever memories of dust-filled explosions and screaming children threatened to drag him under. They'd recently begun training as a therapy team, Mason hoping to give them both purpose again. Amanda Thompson hadn't noticed the newcomers much. Between 12-hour shifts at Oak Ridge Medical Center's emergency department and caring for Olivia, the young widow barely had time to breathe. Her husband's convoy had struck an IED in Helmand Province 4 years ago, leaving her alone to raise their daughter, who'd been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder shortly after. Liv, as everyone called her, rarely spoke but communicated through detailed drawings that Amanda proudly displayed throughout their modest home. Frank Miller considered himself Oak Ridge's unofficial guardian. The retired police chief of 30 years had watched the town transform with a mixture of resignation and resistance. At 68, his opinions carried weight, particularly among the older residents who remembered when the mill employed half the town. None of them could have predicted how their lives would collide that Sunday afternoon in late June, when the pristine trails of Oak Ridge Nature Preserve became the stage for a misunderstanding that would tear apart the fragile fabric of their small community and force each of them to confront what they believed about loyalty, judgment, and heroism. Sunday mornings in Oak Ridge typically found the nature preserve busy with hikers, bird watchers, and families seeking respite from the summer heat beneath the towering Douglas firs. This particular morning, Mason had risen before dawn, hoping to avoid the crowds and give Ranger some much-needed training time off-leash. The VA therapist had suggested routine and purpose would help them both adjust to civilian life. "Good boy," Mason murmured as Ranger perfectly executed a series of commands. His ears perked forward attentively. They'd found a secluded clearing half a mile from the main trails, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Mason reached into his pocket for a treat, watching with satisfaction as the German shepherd sat patiently, his dark eyes never leaving his master's face. "At ease, buddy." At the release command, Ranger's posture relaxed, though he remained vigilant. That was the challenge with military dogs, teaching them it was okay to stand down sometimes. Mason knew the feeling all too well. A quarter-mile away, Amanda Thompson spread a checkered blanket beneath an ancient oak tree, unpacking the lunch she'd prepared for their mother-daughter day. Olivia knelt nearby, absorbed in the wildflowers dotting the grassy area, her small fingers gently touching the petals with characteristic methodical care. "Stay where I can see you, Liv," Amanda reminded, arranging sandwiches on paper plates. The preserve was safe, one of the reasons she'd chosen Oak Ridge when relocating after Jim's death, but maternal vigilance never quite switched off. Liv didn't acknowledge the instruction verbally, but Amanda knew she'd heard. The girl's exceptional focus was both a gift and a challenge of her condition. Amanda checked her watch. They had 2 hours before she needed to prepare for her night shift at the medical center. These stolen moments with Liv were precious, increasingly rare as the hospital faced staffing shortages. She watched her daughter move toward the edge of their chosen spot, sketchbook clutched in one hand, lost in her private world of shapes and colors. The first warning came when Ranger suddenly stiffened, his training forgotten as his nose lifted to the air. Mason noticed the change immediately. "Ranger, focus," he commanded. But the dog's attention had shifted completely. A low whine built in his throat, a sound Mason recognized from their deployment days. Danger detection. "What is it?" "Boy." Mason scanned the tree line, hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that was no longer there. Ranger's body trembled with tension, eyes fixed on something beyond the clearing. Before Mason could react further, Ranger bolted, a blur of black and tan disappearing into the underbrush. "Ranger, heel!" Mason's command echoed uselessly as he sprinted after his dog, pulse pounding in his temples. This had never happened before, not since Afghanistan. Olivia had wandered farther than Amanda realized. Following a patch of particularly vibrant wildflowers, the girl had discovered a thicket of bushes bearing clusters of glossy red berries. They resembled the raspberries her mother bought at the farmer's market, but rounder, more perfectly formed, beautiful, with the singular focus characteristic of her condition. Liv set down her sketchbook and reached for the berries, collecting several in her small palm. They looked like the candies Grandma sometimes gave her, sweet and tempting. She brought them closer to her face, studying their perfect roundness before lifting them toward her mouth. Ranger crashed through the undergrowth, covering the distance in powerful strides. Every instinct, every training scenario recognizing the imminent threat. The scent markers were unmistakable, the same toxic compounds he'd been trained to identify in Afghanistan, where local children sometimes ate poisonous plants out of desperate hunger. Mason was 30 seconds behind, crashing through branches, calling his dog's name, Then he heard it, a child's scream cutting through the forest stillness. Olivia didn't register the approaching animal until it was upon her, a mass of fur and muscle slamming into her small frame. She fell backward, berries scattering as she hit the ground. Before she could recover, sharp teeth closed around her wrist, not breaking skin at first, but firmly gripping, shaking until the remaining berries fell from her fingers. The pain came when she tried to pull away, the dog's teeth scratching her skin, drawing blood. Panic exploded in her chest, releasing the piercing scream that brought the forest to attention. Frank Miller had been enjoying his regular Sunday constitutional, walking stick in hand, nodding to passing families on the main trail when he heard the commotion. Despite his age, he moved with surprising speed toward the sound, breaking into the small clearing just as Olivia's scream reached its terrifying peak. The tableau before him required no interpretation, a large German shepherd attacking a defenseless child. His police instincts kicked in immediately. "Hey, get back!" he shouted, rushing forward with walking stick raised. Two younger hikers, a couple in their 20s, appeared behind him, the man immediately rushing to help. Mason burst into the clearing seconds later, taking in the chaotic scene with horror. "Ranger! Release now!" The dog immediately obeyed, backing away from Olivia, but the damage was done. Blood trickled from the child's wrist. Her face contorted in terror and pain. The berries lay forgotten on the forest floor as Frank and the male hiker grabbed Ranger's collar, roughly pulling him backward. "Call 911, the young woman shouted, kneeling beside Olivia, who continued to wail, curled protectively around her injured arm. "That's my dog, he wouldn't—" Mason began. But his explanation was cut short by Amanda's arrival. She'd heard her daughter's scream and abandoned everything, running blindly toward the sound. "Liv! Oh my God! Liv!" Amanda fell to her knees beside her daughter, gathering the trembling child into her arms. When she saw the blood on Olivia's wrist, her face transformed into a mask of fury. "What happened? Who let this happen?" "That animal attacked her," Frank stated firmly, still gripping Ranger's collar while the dog whined anxiously. "Came out of nowhere and took her down. He was trying to—" Mason stepped forward, only to be cut off by Amanda's rage. "Keep that monster away from my daughter," she screamed, her medical training temporarily overridden by maternal instinct. "Who owns this dog?" "Ma'am, I can explain." Mason tried again, heart sinking as he saw the gathering crowd, the judgment already forming in their expressions. He'd seen that look before civilians who didn't understand, who couldn't comprehend the complexity behind a moment of violence. From the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by summer growth, the faded warning sign about toxic plants went unnoticed as the first sirens sounded in the distance. The fluorescent lights of Oak Ridge Medical Center buzzed overhead as Dr. Eleanor Winters cleaned the shallow wounds on Olivia's wrist. The examination room felt crowded with Amanda hovering anxiously beside the table, Sheriff Dale Cooper leaning against the wall with notepad in hand, and Mason standing awkwardly by the door, having been reluctantly permitted to explain his side. "These punctures aren't deep," Dr. Winters observed, her voice carrying the faint remnant of an East Coast education. "No tendon damage, minimal muscle trauma. She'll be sore for a few days, but with proper cleaning and antibiotics, there shouldn't be any lasting physical damage." Amanda barely registered the diagnosis, her attention fixed on her daughter's tear-streaked face. Liv hadn't spoken a word since the incident, her eyes wide and distant in that way that Amanda recognized her daughter retreating into her internal world when external stimuli became overwhelming. "That dog shouldn't have been off-leash," she said for the third time, not looking at Mason. "The preserve has clear rules about this." Mason shifted his weight, the familiar tightness of anxiety gripping his chest. "I understand you're upset, ma'am, but Ranger wasn't attacking your daughter. He was preventing her from eating those berries." "Berries?" Sheriff Cooper looked up from his notepad. "You didn't mention berries before." "I tried to, but—" Mason gestured helplessly toward Frank Miller, who'd insisted on accompanying them to the medical center. The older man stood in the hallway, visible through the exam room's small window. "Convenient explanation," Amanda snapped. "My daughter is terrified of dogs now because yours wasn't properly controlled, and you're inventing stories about berries." Dr. Winters finished applying a bandage to Olivia's wrist. "There's no evidence of any plant material in the wounds or on her hands. Just the typical abrasions and punctures consistent with a dog bite." Mason ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, frustration mounting. By the time everyone arrived, she'd dropped them. They were small red berries, growing on a bush near where she was sitting. "I know Ranger's behavior. He was trained to respond to threats." Sheriff Cooper straightened, tucking his notepad into his uniform pocket. At 45. Dale Cooper embodied the careful neutrality required of small-town law enforcement maintaining order while navigating the complex relationships of a community where everyone knew everyone. "Mr. Hayes, I understand Ranger is a former military dog," he asked. Mason nodded. "Yes. He served with me in Afghanistan, explosive detection primarily, but he was also trained to identify certain toxins and chemicals." He hesitated before adding, "He saved lives over there." The sheriff's expression remained impassive. "Military training might explain the aggressive response, but it doesn't change the fact that a child was injured in a public space." "Aggressive?" Mason's voice rose slightly. "If Ranger had wanted to hurt her, we wouldn't be talking about minor scratches. He was using the minimum force necessary to—" "That's enough," Amanda interrupted, wrapping a protective arm around Olivia's shoulders. "I don't care what your dog was trained to do in a war zone. This is Oak Ridge, and he attacked my daughter." "Doctor." Winters finished her paperwork and handed Amanda a prescription. "Antibiotics. Twice daily for 7 days. Watch for signs of infection, increased redness, swelling, unusual discharge. Come back immediately if you notice anything concerning." As Amanda helped Olivia down from the examination table, Frank Miller entered the room, his presence seeming to fill the small space. "Sheriff, what happens now? That dog is clearly dangerous." Sheriff Cooper sighed. "There's a protocol for animal incidents. The dog will need to be evaluated by animal control, and we'll take statements from all witnesses." Mason felt a cold dread spreading through his chest. Ranger is not dangerous. He's been through extensive training and certification. This was a specific response to a specific threat. A threat no one else saw. Frank pointed out, "I was there within seconds of the attack, and I didn't see any berries. Because they were on the ground by then," Mason insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Look, I can take you back to the exact spot. The bushes are still there." Sheriff Cooper held up a hand. "We'll investigate the scene. Mr. Hayes, For now. I need to know where your dog is." "My neighbor is watching him," Mason replied. "An army buddy who understands him." Frank cleared his throat. "Sheriff, I've called an emergency town meeting for tomorrow evening. This incident raises serious concerns about dangerous animals in our community. The council should hear about this." Amanda, who had been gathering Olivia's things, looked up sharply. "We'll be there. People need to know what happened." Mason felt the room closing in on him. The familiar sensation of being trapped, of having control stripped away. It triggered memories he'd spent years trying to suppress the helplessness of watching threats unfold without being able to intervene in time. As they exited the examination room, the fluorescent lights caught Olivia's face, illuminating a peculiar expression that no one noticed, not confusion or fear, but a searching look. Her eyes darting between the adults as if trying to communicate something no one was hearing. Back at the Thompson home that evening, Amanda tucked Olivia into bed, her heart aching at the way her daughter flinched when the neighbor's small terrier barked in the distance. She sat on the edge of the bed, gently stroking Liv's hair. "You're safe now, sweetheart. That dog won't hurt you again." Liv didn't respond verbally, not unusual, but reached for her sketchbook on the nightstand. Amanda watched as her daughter flipped to a fresh page and began drawing with focused intensity, expecting to see the traumatic event depicted in childish strokes. Amanda was surprised when Liv instead drew a bush with small round objects that looked like berries. "Is this what you were looking at in the forest?" Amanda asked. Liv continued drawing without acknowledgement, adding a dark shape that might have been the dog. Amanda sighed, setting the sketchbook aside and kissing her daughter's forehead. "Time for sleep now. The medicine will help your arm feel better." Across town, Mason sat on his porch steps, Ranger lying at his feet. The dog sensed his distress, occasionally nudging Mason's hand with his nose, a gesture of solidarity. "We've survived worse, haven't we, boy?" Mason murmured, scratching behind Ranger's ears. But the knot in his stomach tightened as he recalled the town meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Small communities could be merciless when they perceived a threat to one of their own, especially a child. His phone buzzed with a text from Sheriff Cooper. "Animal control evaluation scheduled for Wednesday, 48 hours to provide any evidence supporting your account." Mason stared at the message. Memories of another time flooding back the Afghan village, the little girl with flowers clutched in her hand, Ranger barking desperately as she approached the hidden explosive. They hadn't reached her in time then. The weight of that failure pressed down on him as he looked at Ranger, the loyal partner who had never let him down, even when Mason had failed himself. "I won't let them take you," he promised quietly. "Not when you were just doing what you were trained to do." As darkness settled over Oak Ridge, the seeds of division had already been planted, a community preparing to choose sides in a conflict where the only witness unable to speak was perhaps the only one who knew the complete truth. The community center's parking lot overflowed with vehicles the following evening, forcing latecomers to park along the narrow shoulder of Oak Ridge's main street. Inside, folding chairs scraped against linoleum as townsfolk jostled for seats, the buzz of conversation rising like a swarm of agitated bees. Mason slipped in through the side entrance, choosing to stand against the back wall rather than face the sea of curious, hostile stares. Frank Miller commanded the makeshift podium at the front of the room, his weathered face grave beneath the fluorescent lights. Beside him sat 3 town council members, Sheriff Cooper and Dr. Winters, who had apparently been asked to provide medical testimony. Amanda Thompson occupied the front row, Olivia beside her, the child's bandaged wrist clearly visible as she bent over her ever-present sketchbook. "Folks, thank you for coming on such short notice," Frank began, his authoritative voice immediately quieting the room. "As many of you have already heard, we had a serious incident at our nature preserve yesterday. A child was attacked by a dog, and as a community that prides itself on safety, especially for our little ones, we need to address this promptly." Mason felt eyes shifting toward him, the whispers rippling through the crowd. News traveled fast in Oak Ridge. By noon, everyone knew about the military dog that attacked Olivia Thompson. He straightened his posture, years of military discipline keeping his expression neutral despite the anxiety churning in his stomach. Frank gestured toward Amanda. "Mrs. Thompson, would you like to share what happened to your daughter?" Amanda rose, one hand protectively on Olivia's shoulder. "My daughter and I were enjoying a peaceful Sunday at the preserve when a German shepherd came charging out of nowhere. The dog knocked Liv to the ground and bit her." Her voice caught slightly. "She's 6 years old and weighs 45 pounds. This animal is nearly twice her weight. If Mr. Miller and those hikers hadn't intervened..." She left the implication hanging in the air. Dr. Winters spoke next, clinically describing Olivia's injuries while projecting photographs of the bandaged wounds onto a screen. Mason winced at the images, though he knew the scratches were superficial. Context was everything, and without it, Ranger appeared exactly as they portrayed him, a dangerous animal that had drawn blood from a child. "Sheriff Cooper, what's being done about this dog?" called out Eleanor Pritchett, who ran the elementary school. Sheriff Cooper stepped forward, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. "The dog, Ranger, is currently restricted to its owner's property. Animal Control will conduct an official evaluation tomorrow. Based on those results and our investigation, we'll determine appropriate action according to county regulations." "What about the owner?" someone else called out. All eyes turned to Mason, who forced himself to meet their gaze steadily. "Mr. Hayes is present and has cooperated fully with our investigation," Sheriff Cooper replied. "He maintains that his dog was responding to what it perceived as a threat to the child." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. Frank cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes claims his dog was trying to prevent Olivia from eating poisonous berries. However, no such berries were found at the scene when deputies searched yesterday afternoon, because they were small and scattered when she dropped them," Mason interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. "Birds and wildlife would have taken them within hours, but the bushes are still there." "Convenient explanation," Frank replied dismissively. "I was there within seconds of the attack. I saw no berries." Mason stepped forward, aware he was losing the room before he'd even had a chance. "Ranger is a highly trained military dog. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan detecting explosives and protecting soldiers and civilians. He's certified as a therapy dog and has never shown aggression without cause." "Afghanistan isn't Oak Ridge," Frank countered. "Whatever your dog was trained to do in a war zone doesn't belong around our children." A chorus of agreement followed, and Mason felt his hope sinking. He glanced at Olivia, wishing the child could speak up, could tell them what had really happened. But she remained absorbed in her drawing, seemingly oblivious to the debate raging around her. "I propose," Frank continued, "that regardless of tomorrow's evaluation, we amend our town ordinances to require all former military working dogs to be muzzled in public spaces." "That's discriminatory," Mason protested. "Military dogs are among the best trained." "My girl has nightmares now," Amanda interrupted, tears glistening in her eyes. "She flinches at every dog she sees. Dr. Winters says she's showing signs of acute stress. Are you saying your dog's freedom is more important than my daughter's trauma?" Mason had no answer that wouldn't sound callous. The familiar weight of helplessness pressed down on him. The same sensation he'd felt watching comrades fall in firefights he couldn't control. From the back of the room, a new voice spoke up. "I'd like to hear more about these alleged poisonous berries." Heads turned to see an elderly man with wild white hair and a rumpled shirt rising from his seat. Dr. Samuel Jenkins rarely attended town functions, preferring the company of his greenhouse plants to people. His reputation as an eccentric was cemented by his habit of referring to plants by their Latin names in casual conversation. Frank sighed visibly. "Dr. Jenkins, with all due respect, we're discussing a public safety issue, not botany." "Botany is a public safety issue when poisonous plants are involved," Jenkins replied, unfazed. "What did these berries look like, Mr. Hayes?" Mason seized the lifeline. Small, round, bright red, growing in clusters on a bush with compound leaves, about this big, he indicated with his fingers, in the shaded area off the main trail, near the big oak. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. "Could be Actaea rubra red baneberry, highly toxic, especially to children. 2 or 3 berries could cause severe poisoning, possibly death in a child Olivia's size." A troubled murmur passed through the crowd. "If such dangerous plants exist in our preserve, why haven't we been warned?" Amanda demanded. "There are warning signs posted," Jenkins replied. "But nature doesn't organize itself according to human convenience. Native poisonous plants are part of our ecosystem." Frank waved this away. "We're getting off track. The issue is a dangerous dog, not hypothetical berries no one saw except Mr. Hayes." "I'll help you look for evidence," Jenkins said to Mason, ignoring Frank. "Tomorrow morning, first light." The meeting continued for another hour, degenerating into heated arguments about dog regulations, parental supervision, and community safety. By the time it concluded, the town had effectively divided into camps, those who believed Ranger was dangerous and those willing to consider Mason's explanation. The latter group was significantly smaller. As people filed out, Mason approached Amanda, who was gathering Olivia's things. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm truly sorry your daughter was frightened," he said quietly. "But I need you to understand Ranger was trying to help her." Amanda's expression hardened. "My husband died serving this country. Mr. Hayes, I respect your service and your dog's, but that doesn't change what happened to my daughter." Before Mason could respond, he noticed Olivia tugging at her mother's sleeve, holding up her sketchbook. The page showed a crude but recognizable drawing of red circles arranged in a cluster. "What is it, sweetie?" Amanda asked. Olivia pointed to the drawing, then to her mouth, then made a pushing motion with her hand that Mason immediately recognized the universal gesture for no or stop. "She's trying to tell you," Mason said carefully. "She was going to eat something, and something stopped her." Amanda pulled Olivia closer. "Don't put words in my daughter's mouth. She's traumatized and expressing it through drawing, which is normal for her. Dr. Winters explained this." Mason watched helplessly as Amanda led Olivia away, the child looking back at him with an expression he couldn't interpret: confusion, perhaps, or something more complex that her limited communication couldn't express. Dawn found Mason and Dr. Jenkins trudging through dewy undergrowth at the nature preserve, retracing the path to where the incident had occurred. Jenkins moved with surprising agility for his age, equipped with specimen bags, a camera, and a worn field guide to Pacific Northwest plants. "I was beginning to think there weren't any sensible people left in this town," the botanist remarked, inspecting a cluster of ferns. "Mass hysteria is fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but rather tiresome to experience firsthand." Mason appreciated the man's bluntness. "Thank you for helping. No one else would listen. People hear what they expect to hear," Jenkins replied, "and they fear what they don't understand. Your dog represents something foreign: military precision, controlled violence. It makes them uncomfortable." They reached the clearing where Olivia had been sitting. Mason pointed to a thicket of bushes at its edge. "There. That's where she was, when Ranger ran to her." Jenkins approached the bushes carefully, pushing aside branches with a gloved hand. After a thorough examination, he straightened with a troubled expression. "Actia rubra, as I suspected, red baneberry, but there are no berries on these particular plants." Mason's heart sank. "They were there Sunday, clusters of them." "I believe you," Jenkins said, still studying the plant. "See these stems? Berries were attached here recently. Birds likely took them. They're immune to the toxins that affect humans." He photographed the bushes meticulously. "The plant itself is evidence, but without the actual berries—" "It won't be enough," Mason finished, the familiar weight of failure settling on his shoulders. Back at his cabin, Mason found a certified letter from County Animal Control. The evaluation was scheduled for 2 p.m., leaving them just hours to find conclusive evidence. He called Sheriff Cooper, who had been the most neutral party throughout the ordeal. "Sheriff, Dr. Jenkins confirmed baneberry bushes at the exact location. Isn't that enough to at least postpone the evaluation? Plants without berries don't prove your dog was preventing Olivia from eating something toxic," Cooper replied, his tone regretful but firm. "The county has procedures. Mason, I can't intervene without substantive evidence." Mason hung up and sank onto his porch steps, Ranger settling beside him with a concerned whine. The dog nudged his hand, a gesture that had comforted Mason through the worst moments of post-combat stress. "I know, buddy," he murmured, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "You did the right thing. I'm the one who's failing you now." His thoughts drifted to Afghanistan, to the village of Kandahar province where they'd been clearing roots of IEDs. The little girl with flowers, or what they'd thought were flowers, clutched in her hand. Ranger barking frantically, trying to alert them to the danger she was approaching. They'd thought he was reacting to a potential explosive. By the time they realized she was holding toxic desert plants, she'd already eaten them. Despite their medic's best efforts, she'd died before the medevac arrived. The memory haunted Mason's nightmares for years, the way her small body convulsed, the helplessness in her mother's eyes. Ranger had tried to warn them, just as he'd tried to warn about Olivia. Across town, Amanda was folding laundry when she noticed Olivia sitting at the kitchen table, intensely focused on her drawing. Since the incident, her daughter had filled pages with variations of the same image's circles that might be berries, a dark shape that resembled a dog, and a small figure that was clearly herself. Amanda had attributed it to processing trauma. But now, watching Liv meticulously color the circles bright red, doubt began to creep in. She thought of Mason Hayes's insistence about the berries, of Olivia's gesture at the town meeting. What if there was more to the story? The responsible nurse in her believed in evidence, in verifying facts before drawing conclusions. Had she been too quick to judge, Amanda set down the laundry basket and picked up her phone, hesitating before dialing Sheriff Cooper. "Sheriff, it's Amanda Thompson. Has there been any update on the investigation at the preserve?" Dr. Jenkins confirmed baneberry bushes at the location, Cooper replied. But without actual berries as evidence, the evaluation is proceeding as scheduled. Baneberry? How dangerous is that to children? Cooper's voice grew serious. According to Jenkins, very causes severe gastric distress, respiratory problems, cardiac effects, potentially fatal to someone Olivia's size. Amanda glanced at her daughter, still absorbed in her drawing. And if Olivia had eaten these berries, she'd have been in the ICU instead of getting bandaged for a dog bite. After hanging up, Amanda knelt beside Olivia, gently turning the sketchbook toward her. "Sweetie, these red things you keep drawing, were you going to eat these in the forest?" Olivia nodded, continuing to color. "And the dog, did it stop you? Did it keep you from eating them?" Another nod, this one accompanied by a motion of her hand pushing away the imaginary berries, the same gesture she'd made at the town meeting. Amanda felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She'd been so consumed by maternal protection, so quick to assign blame, that she'd missed what her daughter had been trying to tell her. If Mason Hayes was right, if his dog had actually saved Olivia from poisoning, then she'd been leading a campaign against the very animal that had protected her child. She reached for her phone again, but hesitated. The animal control evaluation was in less than 2 hours. What evidence did she really have? Drawings from a nonverbal child in bushes without berries? Would that be enough to convince Frank and the others? Would it be enough to save Ranger? Amanda closed her eyes, remembering her late husband's words about his military K-9 units. Those dogs don't just follow orders, they make judgment calls that save lives every day. Sometimes they see dangers we can't. With sudden resolve, she gathered Olivia's sketchbook and helped her daughter into her jacket. "We're going for a drive, sweetie. There's something important we need to do." As Mason prepared to take Ranger to the animal control facility, he was surprised by a knock at his door. Opening it, he found Sheriff Cooper standing on his porch, hat in hand. "Sheriff, got something you should see," Cooper said, gesturing to his patrol car where Amanda Thompson stood beside the open passenger door, Olivia at her side. Mason stepped outside cautiously, Ranger at his heel. The dog's posture remained alert but calm, no sign of the aggression he'd been accused of harboring. Mrs. Thompson has some new information, Cooper explained. Thought you should hear it before the evaluation. Amanda approached slowly, holding Olivia's hand. My daughter has been trying to tell me something through her drawings, she said, her voice carrying a note of regret. I wasn't listening. She held out the sketchbook. I think your dog might have saved her life. Mr. Hayes. As Mason accepted the offered pages, Olivia looked directly at Ranger for the first time, without fear, her expression holding a recognition that transcended words. In that moment, something shifted in Oak Ridge, a small bridge forming across a divide that had seemed impossibly wide just hours before. The county animal control facility occupied a concrete block building at the edge of town, its institutional green walls and fluorescent lighting doing nothing to soften the sense of finality that hung in the air. Ranger sat perfectly still beside Mason in the waiting area, his posture military straight, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. Amanda had insisted on accompanying them. Olivia's sketchbook clutched in her hands like evidence in a trial. The evaluator is Mr. Peterson, Sheriff Cooper explained in a low voice. He's by the book. Been doing this 20 years. Show him the drawings, but don't expect an immediate reversal. These proceedings have protocols. Mason nodded, his hand resting on Ranger's head, drawing strength from the dog's unwavering calm. The clock on the wall read 1:52 p.m., 8 minutes, until the evaluation that could separate him from the partner who'd pulled him through his darkest days. Beyond the immediate crisis, Mason understood the deeper implications. If Ranger was classified as dangerous, no amount of therapy certification would overcome the label. Their plans to work with veterans suffering from PTSD would evaporate. Amanda leaned closer, speaking just above a whisper. I called Dr. Jenkins on the way here. He's going to meet us with additional documentation about the Baneberry plants. He said something about similar cases. Before Mason could respond, a side door opened and a man in a gray uniform emerged, clipboard in hand. Raymond Peterson had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions about animals that other people had failed. His expression revealed nothing as he surveyed the unusual group assembled in his waiting room. Mr. Hayes, we're ready for Ranger's evaluation. Mason rose, Ranger perfectly in step beside him. Sir, before we begin, there's new information about the incident that you should consider. Peterson's face remained impassive. The evaluation is standardized. Mr. Hayes, we observe the animal's behavior in controlled scenarios to assess potential aggression triggers. Background context is noted but doesn't affect the testing protocols. But this isn't about context, Amanda interjected, stepping forward. It's about the fundamental nature of the incident. My daughter was never attacked. She was being protected from poisonous berries she was about to eat. Peterson's gaze shifted to Amanda, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. Mrs. Thompson, I was told you were the one filing the complaint against this animal. I was wrong, Amanda said firmly, opening Olivia's sketchbook. My daughter has been trying to tell me what really happened through her drawings. She's on the autism spectrum and has limited verbal communication, but she's been consistent in what she's trying to express. She displayed the pages of meticulously drawn scenes, the red berries, Olivia reaching for them, the dog intervening. The progression was clear even in the child's simple artistic style. Peterson studied the drawings with professional detachment. While I appreciate this perspective, Mrs. Thompson, a child's drawings aren't conclusive evidence for our purposes. The evaluation must proceed as scheduled. At that moment, the facility's front door burst open and Dr. Jenkins hurried in, clutching a leather satchel and breathing heavily. "Sorry I'm late," he wheezed, adjusting his glasses. "Had to gather the necessary materials." "Dr. Jenkins." Sheriff Cooper nodded in greeting. "Mr. Peterson was just explaining that Ranger's evaluation needs to proceed regardless of new context." "Context?" Jenkins scoffed. "This isn't about context, young man. It's about scientific fact." He opened his satchel and extracted a folder, slapping it down on the reception counter. Actia rubra red baneberry, native to this region and highly toxic, particularly to children. These photos confirm the presence of the plant exactly where the incident occurred. Peterson reluctantly accepted the folder, scanning its contents with practiced efficiency. The plants. Yes. But where are the berries? Without confirmation that the child was actually in danger of consuming something toxic, we can't validate the dog's alleged protective response. That's where this comes in, Jenkins continued, extracting a medical journal from his satchel. 3 cases in Oregon last year of children hospitalized after consuming wild berries. 2 were confirmed baneberry poisonings. One of those children, a 4-year-old boy, survived only because of immediate medical intervention. Mason watched Peterson's expression carefully, searching for any sign of wavering. The evaluator's professionalism remained intact, but a new thoughtfulness had entered his eyes as he reviewed the documentation. "Furthermore," Jenkins added, producing a small plastic container, "this morning I located an additional baneberry bush in the preserve, approximately 50 yards from the incident site, with berries intact." He set the container on the counter, the bright red berries clearly visible through the clear plastic. Peterson frowned. These weren't collected from the actual location of the incident. Same species, same toxicity, Jenkins countered, and proof that these berries are currently in season and present in the preserve exactly where this child was playing. The standoff might have continued, but it was interrupted by a sudden commotion as the facility's front door opened again. Frank Miller entered, followed by 2 town council members and, surprisingly, Dr. Winters. "We heard there was an attempt to circumvent the proper evaluation," Frank announced, his voice carrying the authority he'd wielded in Oak Ridge for decades. "The town has a right to ensure this process is handled correctly." Sheriff Cooper stepped forward. "Frank, this isn't a town matter anymore. It's a county procedure. When it involves the safety of our children, it's everyone's matter." Frank replied sharply. His gaze fell on Amanda, and genuine confusion crossed his features. "Amanda, what are you doing here? I thought you'd be at home with Olivia." "She's with my mother," Amanda replied, her voice steady despite the tension filling the small space. "I'm here because I believe a mistake is being made. Ranger wasn't attacking my daughter. He was saving her life." Frank's expression hardened. "You're not thinking clearly. The trauma of seeing your child injured. Don't patronize me." "Frank," Amanda cut him off, a new steel in her voice. "I've spent 2 days so focused on the dog bite that I missed what Olivia was trying to tell me. She was going to eat these." She pointed to the container of berries on the counter. "Doctor." Winters stepped closer, examining the berries with professional interest. "Red baneberry. These are highly toxic. Precisely. Jenkins nodded emphatically. 2 or 3 berries could cause severe poisoning in a child, Olivia's size. Symptoms include burning of the throat and mouth, severe gastric distress, dizziness, and, in severe cases, respiratory distress and cardiac effects. The medical terminology seemed to reach Dr. Winters in a way the emotional arguments hadn't. She turned to Frank with a troubled expression. If the child was about to consume these and the dog intervened, its action, while frightening, may have prevented a life-threatening emergency. Frank seemed unmoved. This is all speculation. No one actually saw the child with these specific berries. I did. Mason spoke up quietly. I saw her collect them just before Ranger responded. But by the time I reached them, by the time any of you arrived, they'd been knocked from her hand. The room fell silent, the opposing narratives hanging in the air between them. Peterson cleared his throat, uncomfortable with finding his routine evaluation at the center of a community dispute. Regardless of the circumstances, I'm required to complete the behavioral assessment, he stated firmly. If you'll follow me, Mr. Hayes. Mason nodded, gently commanding Ranger to heel as they moved toward the evaluation room. As they reached the door, a small sound stopped everyone in their tracks. Dog! Help! All eyes turned to the source. Olivia stood in the doorway, having evidently followed her mother to the facility. The 2 simple words hung in the air, stunning those who knew the child rarely spoke. Amanda rushed to her daughter, kneeling to eye level. Liv, sweetie. What did you say? Olivia's face scrunched with the effort of verbal communication. Dog, help, bad berries? She pointed directly at Ranger, then made her pushing away gesture. The room fell silent again, this time with the weight of undeniable testimony. Even Frank seemed at a loss for words, his certainty visibly shaken by the child's unexpected intervention. Peterson looked from Olivia to Ranger, then to the container of berries, his professional detachment finally cracking. I've been doing this job for 20 years, he said slowly. Most cases are straightforward neglect, poor training, genuine aggression. This is not that. He turned to Mason. The evaluation still needs to happen. That's procedure. But I'll note the mitigating circumstances and the apparent protective nature of the dog's actions in my report. Relief washed over Mason so intensely that he had to steady himself against the wall. Ranger, sensing the shift in energy, relaxed his posture slightly, his intelligent eyes moving between the humans as if tracking the resolution of a complex problem. The evaluation itself was anticlimactic after the emotional confrontation. Ranger performed flawlessly through each scenario, showing appropriate responses to simulated threats without aggression, demonstrating his training and temperament. Peterson's notes grew increasingly positive as the assessment progressed. This dog has exceptional training, he remarked during a pause in the testing. Military working dogs undergo rigorous selection and conditioning. Less than half of candidates make it through the program. By the end of the hour, Peterson's conclusion was clear. Based on today's assessment, I find no evidence of unprovoked aggression or dangerous behavior patterns. Ranger responds appropriately to perceived threats and shows excellent command compliance. He stamped a form and handed it to Mason. No action required. This dog poses no abnormal risk to public safety. The small crowd that had gathered outside the evaluation room received the news with mixed reactions. Dr. Jenkins beamed with vindication. Sheriff Cooper nodded with professional satisfaction, and Amanda exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for days. Frank Miller's face remained unreadable, his worldview visibly challenged by the turn of events. "I'd like to make a statement," Amanda said as they gathered in the waiting area. "As Olivia's mother, I'm withdrawing any complaint against Ranger and his owner. Based on my daughter's communication and the evidence presented today, I believe this dog acted to protect my child from serious harm." She turned to Mason, genuine regret in her expression. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry. When you see your child bleeding and terrified, it's easy to make assumptions without having all the facts." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know something about protective instincts. They can sometimes blind us to the bigger picture." As they exited the facility, the afternoon sunlight seemed brighter somehow, the tension of the past 48 hours beginning to dissipate. But Mason knew the battle wasn't entirely won. Public perception wouldn't change overnight, and the whispered label of dangerous dog wouldn't immediately disappear from Ranger's reputation in Oak Ridge. Sheriff Cooper seemed to read his thoughts. "There's a town council meeting tomorrow night. Might be good for you to attend, set the record straight officially." He glanced at Olivia, who was cautiously watching Ranger from the safety of her mother's side. "Sometimes it takes a child to show adults what really matters." As Mason loaded Ranger into his truck, he noticed Olivia approaching slowly, Amanda watching carefully from a few steps behind. The girl stopped at a respectful distance, then held out her sketchbook. Open to a new drawing, a simple but recognizable portrait of Ranger, with what appeared to be a cape. "Super dog," she said softly, her eyes meeting Mason's with a clarity that transcended her communication challenges. In that moment, Mason saw the first bridge forming across the divide that had threatened to drive him from yet another place he'd tried to call home. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to believe that Oak Ridge might still hold a place for them both. The victory at the animal control facility proved short-lived. By evening, Mason discovered just how deeply the incident had divided Oak Ridge when he stopped at Muldoon's grocery for supplies. Conversations halted as he entered, replaced by pointed whispers and averted gazes. Mrs. Muldoon herself, who had always greeted him warmly, maintained a stiff politeness as she rang up his purchases, her usual inquiries about his day conspicuously absent. "Heard your dog passed the evaluation," she finally offered, not quite meeting his eyes. "Yes, ma'am. Ranger was cleared completely." She nodded, handing him his change. "That's good. Still, might be wise to keep him close to home for a while. People aren't quick to forget when a child gets hurt, no matter the circumstances." The message was clear. The official ruling might have saved Ranger from euthanasia, but it hadn't restored their standing in the community. As Mason loaded his groceries into his truck, he noticed Frank Miller and several other town elders watching from the bench outside the barber shop across the street, their expressions making it clear that the matter was far from settled in the court of public opinion. Back at his cabin, Mason found 3 messages on his answering machine, all cancellations from veterans who had scheduled therapy sessions with Ranger. The brief, uncomfortable explanations cited recent events and safety concerns. Months of careful networking, building trust with fellow veterans who struggled with the same demons he fought daily. Undone in a matter of days by fear and misinformation, Ranger sensed his distress, pressing against Mason's leg with the steady pressure that had always grounded him when the anxiety threatened to spiral. Mason knelt, burying his face in the dog's thick fur, drawing comfort from the unwavering loyalty of the one companion who had never judged or abandoned him. "Doesn't matter what they think, does it, boy?" he murmured. "We know the truth." But the truth felt cold comfort as he faced the wreckage of the life he'd been building in Oak Ridge. The move had represented his best attempt at reintegration after the military, a small town where he could contribute meaningfully, where his and Ranger's skills could help others heal. Now, it seemed they would become just another casualty of fear and misunderstanding, forced to move on yet again. The next morning brought no reprieve. Mason took Ranger for their usual run along the fire road behind his property, avoiding the more populated trails where they might encounter neighbors. The isolation reminded him too much of those first months after returning from Afghanistan, when he'd barely left his apartment, unable to navigate the overwhelming sensory input of civilian life without panicking. He was checking his mail when a silver sedan pulled into his driveway. Jenkins emerged, his wild white hair even more disheveled than usual, face ashen beneath his perpetual tan. "Jenkins, what's wrong?" Mason called, immediately concerned by the older man's appearance. The botanist gripped the car door for support. "Thought you should hear it from me first," he said, his voice strained. "There's been another incident at the preserve. A child poisoned berry ingestion. They've airlifted him to Portland." The news hit Mason like a physical blow. "What, when?" "This morning. 10-year-old boy, Kyle Prescott. Apparently went off trail with some friends, eating wild berries on a dare." Jenkins removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes wearily. "The symptoms match baneberry poisoning, severe gastrointestinal distress, difficulty breathing. It's serious." Mason leaned against his mailbox, the implications washing over him. Another child, suffering exactly the fate Ranger had prevented for Olivia. The timing couldn't have been worse or more validating. "Have they confirmed it was baneberry?" Jenkins nodded grimly. "I was called to identify samples the other children brought back. It's definitely Actia rubra, same species we found near where your dog intervened with Olivia Thompson." Before Mason could respond, his phone rang. Sheriff Cooper's number flashed on the screen. "Hayes," he answered. "Mason, I need you and Ranger at the preserve. Now." Cooper's voice was tense, urgent. "Frank Miller's organized a group to remove all the baneberry bushes, but they don't know what they're looking for. We need Jenkins, too. If you can find him. He's with me now. We just heard about the Prescott boy. Then you understand the urgency. They're gathering at the main trailhead in 30 minutes. Mason ended the call and turned to Jenkins. "They need us at the preserve. Town vigilantes are about to destroy native plant species in a panic." Jenkins groaned. "Ecological disaster on top of everything else. Let me get my field guides." The scene at the preserve entrance was chaos: pickup trucks and SUVs crowding the small parking area. At least 20 residents armed with gardening tools, work gloves, and trash bags. Frank Miller stood on a picnic table, issuing instructions like a general deploying troops. "Teams of 3, mark any bush with red berries for removal. If you're not sure, bag it anyway. We're not losing another child to these death traps. Sheriff Cooper intercepted Mason and Jenkins before they reached the crowd. "This is getting out of hand," he said in a low voice. "The Prescott boy is in critical condition. Parents are panicking, demanding immediate action. Removing native plants isn't the answer," Jenkins protested. "They need proper identification and education, not a scorched earth response. Try telling them that." Cooper gestured toward the gathering, where emotions clearly outweighed ecological considerations. Mason spotted Amanda Thompson's car pulling into the lot, surprised to see her joining the impromptu task force. She approached their small group, her nurse's scrubs suggesting she'd come directly from a shift. "I heard about Kyle," she said by way of greeting. "His parents are friends of mine." "How is he?" Mason asked. "Critical but stable. The airway inflammation was the biggest concern." She looked toward the crowd, then back at Mason with troubled eyes. "I told them about Olivia and the berries, about Ranger. They don't blame you or your dog. They're grateful there's finally proof of what we've been saying. This unexpected alliance should have been comforting." But Mason felt only a deepening sense of dread. Public opinion was a pendulum that could swing just as violently in the opposite direction. Frank noticed their huddle and approached, his expression hardening when he saw Mason. "This isn't a spectator event, Hayes. Unless you're here to help clean up the mess your dog brought to everyone's attention. You can leave." "Frank," Cooper warned, "this isn't helping. What would help is getting these poisonous plants out of where our children play," Frank shot back. "If his dog hadn't attacked Olivia, we might have identified this threat before another child was harmed." The unfairness of the accusation struck Mason like a physical blow. Ranger prevented a poisoning. If people had listened instead of rushing to judgment, warning signs could have been posted days ago. Frank's face flushed. "Always someone else's fault. Isn't it typical military create a problem, then blame civilians for not handling it right?" The words hit too close to Mason's deepest insecurities, the guilt he carried from Afghanistan. His hands clenched involuntarily, breathing quickening as the familiar pressure built in his chest, the prelude to a panic attack he couldn't afford to have publicly. Ranger pressed against his leg, the trained response to his handler's distress. The contact anchored Mason, pulling him back from the edge. "This isn't about blame," Amanda interjected firmly. "It's about preventing another child from being harmed. Dr. Jenkins is the expert here. We should be listening to him, not charging into the woods destroying everything with berries." Jenkins seized the moment. "I've prepared identification cards," he said, producing a stack of laminated sheets from his satchel. "These show baneberry and 5 other toxic plants common to this area, plus similar-looking non-toxic species for comparison. Education, not eradication, is the answer." Frank looked ready to argue further when his phone rang. The conversation was brief, his expression shifting from annoyance to shock. "That was the hospital," he announced as he hung up. "Kyle Prescott's condition has worsened. They're saying he might not make it." A horrified silence fell over the group, the reality of what they were facing suddenly much starker. This wasn't about a dog anymore, or community standing, or who had been right or wrong. A child's life hung in the balance. "I should be there," Amanda said quietly. His parents will need support. As she turned to leave, she paused beside Mason. The town council meeting tonight, it's still happening. After this, they'll be looking for someone to blame. You should be there. Her eyes held a warning he understood all too well. The crisis that had begun with Ranger and Olivia had evolved into something far more complex, with a community seeking answers and accountability. As Mason watched Amanda drive away, he realized that the tragedy unfolding around them had created an impossible situation. The very proof that validated Ranger's actions had come at the potential cost of a child's life. He knelt beside Ranger, the dog's steady presence, the one constant in a world suddenly shifting beneath his feet. "What do we do now?" "Boy," he whispered, receiving no answer except the distant sound of Kyle Prescott's friends sobbing in their parents' arms, their innocent game having turned into a nightmare no one had seen coming. The emergency town council meeting convened in an atmosphere thick with grief and tension. The elementary school gymnasium, the only venue large enough to accommodate the crowd, hummed with subdued conversations as residents filed in, their faces drawn with worry. News of Kyle Prescott's deteriorating condition had spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire, transforming what had been a divisive issue into a community-wide crisis. Mason sat alone in the back row, without Ranger for the first time in recent memory. He'd made the difficult decision to leave his partner at home, recognizing that the dog's presence might inflame already raw emotions. The separation left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since his early days back from deployment. The council members took their places at a folding table on the gymnasium stage, their usual procedural formalities abandoned in light of the circumstances. Mayor Helen Whitaker, a retired high school principal with 3 decades of crisis management experience, opened the meeting with uncharacteristic gravity. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the Prescott family, who are keeping vigil at Portland Children's Hospital. Our thoughts and prayers are with young Kyle and his parents during this unimaginable ordeal." A respectful silence fell over the room, momentarily uniting the divided community in concern for one of their own. Mason noticed Frank Miller sitting with the front row of town elders, his usual commanding presence diminished by what appeared to be genuine distress. Whatever else might be said about Frank, his dedication to Oak Ridge's children was sincere. "This emergency session," Mayor Whitaker continued, "has been called to address the immediate public safety concerns raised by recent events at Oak Ridge Nature Preserve. We have confirmation from medical authorities that Kyle Prescott is suffering from baneberry poisoning, the same toxic plant that was identified in the incident involving Olivia Thompson earlier this week." Sheriff Cooper stepped forward, official report in hand. "Following Kyle's hospitalization, we conducted a thorough sweep of the preserve with Dr. Jenkins' assistance. We've identified 7 distinct locations with baneberry bushes, primarily in the shadier sections of the trail system. Temporary warning signs have been posted, and the preserve remains closed pending a comprehensive safety review." A man from the middle rows stood up. "My son was with Kyle when he ate those berries. They were playing some stupid game, daring each other. If we'd known the danger—" His voice broke, and he sat down abruptly, overcome with emotion. Mayor Whitaker acknowledged him with a compassionate nod. "The question of public awareness is central to our discussion tonight. How do we ensure our community is properly informed about natural hazards without creating undue fear or restricting access to our natural spaces? Dr. Jenkins was invited to speak next, shuffling to the microphone with the stack of identification cards he'd prepared. Baneberry and other toxic plants are native species that have existed in our forests for thousands of years. They serve ecological functions and cannot simply be eradicated without consequences. The solution is education, not elimination. He held up one of his laminated cards. I've prepared these guides for distribution. They show clear images of dangerous plants alongside similar-looking safe species. With proper knowledge, our children can learn to appreciate nature safely. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, the practical solution appealing to the community's pragmatic sensibilities. But Frank Miller rose slowly to his feet, his expression troubled. With all due respect to Dr. Jenkins' expertise, we're missing the bigger issue here. 2 children have been harmed in our preserve within a single week. One lies fighting for his life. The other was traumatized by a military-trained dog. Whether the dog was trying to help doesn't change the fact that a 6-year-old child was terrified and injured. He turned to face the audience, his gaze eventually finding Mason. We welcomed Mr. Hayes and his dog to our community without question. But perhaps we should have asked more questions about whether a combat-trained animal belongs in a civilian setting, particularly around children. The unfairness of the accusation burned in Mason's chest, but he remained seated, unwilling to create a confrontation that would only reinforce Frank's narrative. To his surprise, Amanda Thompson rose from her seat near the front. As Olivia's mother and a medical professional, I need to correct this characterization, she stated firmly. My daughter wasn't traumatized by Ranger, she was saved by him. The medical evidence is clear. Baneberry poisoning could have killed her, just as it might still take Kyle's life. Without that dog's intervention, I might be the parent sitting in a hospital right now. Or worse. Her voice caught slightly, but she continued with professional composure. Furthermore, I've spent the past several hours with the Prescott family. They don't blame Mr. Hayes or his dog. In fact, they wish someone had taken the Baneberry threat seriously when it was first identified. The failure here isn't with a dog who recognized danger, it's with us, the adults who were too busy arguing to protect our children. The gymnasium fell silent, Amanda's words landing with the weight of incontrovertible truth. Even Frank seemed momentarily at a loss for a rebuttal. Into this charged silence, a new voice spoke up, Dr. Winters, who had been observing from the side of the room. I've just received an update from my colleague at Portland Children's. Kyle has been stabilized and is responding to treatment. His prognosis is now cautiously optimistic. A collective sigh of relief swept through the gymnasium, the tension visibly easing from shoulders throughout the room. Mayor Whitaker offered a brief prayer of thanksgiving before steering the meeting back to its purpose. While this is wonderful news, it doesn't diminish the seriousness of what's occurred or our responsibility to prevent future incidents. The Council needs to decide on immediate actions regarding the preserve and public safety education. What followed was an hour of surprisingly productive discussion. The community's shared concern for Kyle having temporarily bridged ideological divides, the Council voted unanimously to keep the preserve closed for 2 weeks, while comprehensive signage was installed and an educational campaign implemented. Dr. Jenkins was commissioned to lead guided walks identifying dangerous plants, and the school agreed to incorporate wilderness safety into its curriculum. Throughout the proceedings, Mason remained silent, his presence acknowledged, but his input neither requested nor offered. He understood his position in the community had become symbolic, representing either danger or protection, depending on which faction one asked. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. As the meeting concluded, Mason prepared to slip out quietly, avoiding the social awkwardness that had become routine since the incident. He was nearly to the door when Sheriff Cooper intercepted him. "Hold up, Hayes. There's something you should hear." Cooper led him to a small group that had formed near the stage, including Mayor Whitaker, Amanda, and, to Mason's surprise, Frank Miller. The tension between them was palpable, decades of community standing facing off against newly revealed truth. Mayor Whitaker addressed Mason directly. "Mr. Hayes, the council has been discussing the events of this past week. While opinions remain divided on some aspects, we've come to recognize that your dog's actions likely prevented a tragedy similar to what the Prescott family is enduring." Frank cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I've been on the phone with Kyle's father," he said, his usual assertiveness subdued. "Jim Prescott reminded me that when his family moved here 5 years ago, I told him Oak Ridge was a place where we look out for each other. Said it was why they chose to raise their boy here." He met Mason's gaze directly for the first time since the incident. "I've been quick to judge you and your dog based on my own preconceptions about military animals. That wasn't fair. And it certainly wasn't looking out for each other." The admission clearly cost Frank considerable pride, his weathered hands gripping the back of a nearby chair for support. Mason recognized the gesture of a man whose certainties had been shaken, whose view of the world had been forcibly expanded. He'd seen it often enough in the mirror. "I appreciate that, Mr. Miller," Mason replied simply. "Ranger was doing what he was trained to do, identify threats and protect people. That's all he's ever done, whether in Afghanistan or here." Amanda stepped forward, bridging the remaining distance between the opposed men. "The Prescotts would like to thank you properly when Kyle is released from the hospital, and Olivia has been asking to see Ranger again, not out of fear, but because she wants to thank her super dog." She offered a tentative smile. "If you're willing, that is." The unexpected turn left Mason momentarily speechless. After days of isolation and judgment, this gesture of reconciliation seemed almost too fragile to trust. Sheriff Cooper, reading his hesitation correctly, clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Communities like family. Hayes," he said quietly. "We fight. We make mistakes. We judge too quick. But when it matters, we come back together." Mayor Whitaker nodded in agreement. "The council would like to formally recognize Ranger's service to our community at next month's Founders' Day celebration. We think it might help the children and some adults understand the difference between perceiving danger and actually being in danger." As the implications of this olive branch sank in, Mason felt something shift within him, a loosening of the defensive posture he'd maintained since the first accusations flew. Perhaps Oak Ridge could still become the home he and Ranger had been seeking, not despite this crisis, but because of how the community had ultimately responded to it. The gymnasium had nearly emptied when Dr. Jenkins approached, clutching his ever-present satchel. Fascinating how humans need catastrophe to achieve clarity, he observed wryly. One child injured by a dog trying to help her, another poisoned because no one heeded the warning. Now suddenly everyone wants to learn about native plant species. Mason smiled despite himself. Human nature, I suppose. Indeed. Jenkins extracted a folder from his satchel. I've been researching military working dogs since our adventure at the preserve. Quite remarkable animals. The botanical world has much to learn from their sensory capabilities. He hesitated, then added, I understand you've been conducting therapy sessions with veterans. I wonder if you might consider adding a botanical component many find gardening therapeutic, and Ranger's ability to identify toxic plants could be incorporated. The unexpected proposal caught Mason off guard, but he recognized it for what it was, another thread being extended. Another connection offered in a community he'd nearly written off. As Mason drove home that evening, the weight that had pressed on his chest for days had eased significantly. He found himself reflecting on a lesson from his military days that the true measure of a unit wasn't how it performed when everything went according to plan, but how it recovered when everything fell apart. Oak Ridge had been tested by fear, prejudice, and tragedy. Its response had been imperfect, messy, and ultimately human. But beneath the conflict, Mason had glimpsed something vital, a community willing to reconsider its judgments when presented with truth, capable of growth, even through pain. Ranger greeted him at the cabin door with characteristic enthusiasm, his entire body wiggling with joy at his handler's return. As Mason knelt to receive the dog's affection, he whispered into the soft fur, We might just have found our place after all. Buddy, the road ahead would not be without challenges. Trust, once broken, required time to rebuild. But for the first time since the incident, Mason allowed himself to believe that he and Ranger might yet find in Oak Ridge what they had been seeking all along, not just a location to exist, but a community to call home, miles away in a Portland hospital room. Kyle Prescott opened his eyes after hours of touch-and-go treatment, his parents' tearful faces the first thing he saw. And back in Oak Ridge, Olivia Thompson carefully added color to her latest drawing, a German shepherd standing protectively beside a little girl, red berries scattered at their feet, the sun shining brightly overhead. 3 weeks later, Oak Ridge Nature Preserve reopened to the public with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that drew nearly half the town. New educational signs dotted the trail system, their bright colors and clear illustrations identifying both dangerous and beneficial plants native to the area. Children clutched laminated plant identification cards designed by Dr. Jenkins, eager to participate in the scavenger hunt that had been organized as part of the reopening festivities. Mason stood somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, Ranger sitting attentively at his heel. Though they had been officially invited by Mayor Whitaker, he still felt the lingering self-consciousness of someone who had briefly been at the center of a community controversy. Old habits of keeping to himself died hard, especially after years of military service followed by the isolation of PTSD. There you are. Amanda Thompson's voice cut through his thoughts as she approached. Olivia's hand clasped firmly in hers. The little girl wore a blue sundress with sneakers, her usual sketchbook tucked under one arm. We've been looking for you. Liv has something she wants to give Ranger. Mason knelt to Olivia's level, maintaining a respectful distance. Hello, Liv, it's good to see you again." The child regarded him solemnly, then shifted her gaze to Ranger. Without the fear that had marked their previous encounters, her expression held curiosity and something that looked remarkably like admiration. She extended her sketchbook, opened to a page that revealed a carefully drawn certificate decorated with colorful markers. "Hero Dog Award." Mason read aloud, genuine surprise in his voice. "Did you make this for Ranger?" Olivia nodded, then looked up at her mother for support. "She's been working on it all week," Amanda explained, her expression softening. "The therapist suggested it might help her process what happened in a positive way. She understands now that Ranger was protecting her." Mason felt a tightness in his throat. "That's very kind of you. Liv, Ranger would be honored to accept your award." He glanced at Amanda. "Would it be all right if he came a little closer?" At Amanda's nod, Mason gave Ranger the command to approach gently. The German Shepherd moved forward with deliberate slowness, his training evident in every controlled movement. He stopped a foot away from Olivia, sitting down and lowering his head slightly in a non-threatening posture. What happened next surprised everyone. Olivia stepped forward and, with cautious determination, placed her small hand on Ranger's head. "Good dog," she said softly, the words clear despite her usual verbal reticence. The moment hung in the air, weighted with significance beyond the simple gesture. Mason saw in it everything they had all been through, fear transformed into understanding, judgment yielding to truth, wounds beginning to heal. Sheriff Cooper joined them, his uniform freshly pressed for the occasion. "Quite a turnout," he observed, surveying the crowd. "Kyle Prescott and his family just arrived. The boy's looking good, you'd hardly know what he went through." Mason followed Cooper's gaze to where a 10-year-old boy with a shock of red hair was being fussed over by anxious parents. Despite their protective hovering, Kyle's expression was one of pre-adolescent embarrassment mixed with the unmistakable pride of being the center of attention. "The Prescotts would like to meet you and Ranger," Cooper continued. "If you're comfortable with that." Mason hesitated, but Amanda placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It would mean a lot to them," she said, "and to the community." The gathering around the Prescott family parted as Mason approached with Ranger. He could feel curious eyes following them, but the hostility that had marked earlier encounters was notably absent. In its place was something more nuanced, a community reassessing its understanding of both man and dog. Jim Prescott stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Hayes, I'm glad to finally meet you, though I wish it had been under different circumstances." Mason shook the offered hand. "How's your son doing? Better every day? The doctors say there won't be any permanent damage. Thank God." Jim's voice caught slightly. "We've been told that if he'd eaten just 2 more berries, or if we'd waited another 20 minutes to get him to the hospital." He left the sentence unfinished, the implications clear. Kyle stepped forward, regarding Ranger with the frank curiosity of youth. "Is this the dog that tried to stop the other kid from eating the berries?" Mason nodded. "This is Ranger. He's trained to recognize certain dangers." "Cool," Kyle said with genuine admiration. "Dad says if people had listened about what your dog did, I might not have gotten sick." The simple clarity of the boy's statement hung in the air, cutting through the adult complexities that had clouded the situation. From the mouths of babes, Mason thought, became the unvarnished truth that grown-ups so often overcomplicated. Mayor Whitaker called for everyone's attention, directing the crowd toward a newly installed feature near the preserve's entrance, a large educational display about local plant life, crowned with a dedication plaque. In recognition of recent events, she announced, the town council has established this permanent educational station to ensure that future generations can enjoy our natural spaces safely and knowledgeably. She unveiled the plaque with a flourish. And we've named it in honor of the individual who first alerted our community to the danger in our midst. The plaque read, "The Ranger Station dedicated to vigilance, protection, and education." A spontaneous round of applause broke out, catching Mason completely by surprise. He felt a flush of embarrassment mixed with profound gratitude as Frank Miller stepped forward to shake his hand in full view of the assembled community, a public gesture of reconciliation from the man who had been his most vocal critic. "Still think military dogs are better off away from civilians?" Mason asked quietly, unable to resist the small jab. Frank's weathered face creased into a reluctant smile. "Let's just say I've learned not to judge a book by its cover or a dog by its training. This old dog can still learn new tricks, even at my age." As the formal ceremony concluded and people dispersed to explore the newly reopened trails, Mason found himself at the center of a small gathering unlike any he'd experienced in Oak Ridge before. Dr. Jenkins was enthusiastically explaining to several veterans about his proposed horticultural therapy program. Amanda was chatting comfortably with Mason's next-door neighbor, their previous tension replaced by the easy conversation of people with shared concerns. Kyle Prescott had overcome his initial shyness to ask detailed questions about Rangers' military service, while Olivia sat nearby, quietly sketching the unfolding scene. Sheriff Cooper sidled up beside Mason, observing the impromptu community forming around them. "Funny how things work out," he commented. "A week ago, half these folks wouldn't give you the time of day. Now look at them." Mason watched as Ranger patiently allowed several children to pet him under their parents' watchful but no longer fearful supervision. "People fear what they don't understand," he replied. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to bring clarity. Well, whatever it takes, I'd say you and that dog of yours have found your place here." Cooper clapped him on the shoulder before moving off to supervise the trail reopening. As the afternoon sunshine filtered through the trees of the preserve, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced since before his deployment, a sense of belonging, of community, of home. The road had been difficult, marked by misunderstanding and judgment, but also by revelation and growth. Ranger looked up at him, those intelligent eyes somehow conveying understanding of this pivotal moment. Mason knelt beside his faithful companion, the partner who had saved lives in combat zones and now had saved a child in peaceful Oak Ridge, the friend who had stood by him through darkness and light. "We made it, buddy," he whispered, receiving in return the unwavering loyalty that had been his anchor through it all. "We finally made it home." In our fast-paced world where snap judgments often replace careful consideration, the story of Ranger reminds us of a simple truth we've lived long enough to appreciate. Appearances can be deceiving, and second chances matter. And many of us have experienced being misunderstood, labeled, or judged unfairly based on a single moment or circumstance. Like Mason, we've felt the sting of a community's rejection and the warmth of its eventual acceptance. We understand what it means to stand alone with only our convictions to sustain us, waiting for truth to prevail. Perhaps we've been Frank Miller, so certain in our beliefs that we couldn't see beyond them until life taught us humility. Or Amanda Thompson, protective of those we love, sometimes blinded by that very love.